Welcome to the Fire These Times. I'm your host, Joey Ayoub. If you'd like to support this podcast as well as other projects, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes or check out the support page for other methods. If you cannot donate, you can still support this podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening and stay safe out there. So, this is the last episode of 2020, and it's not an original episode. It's actually a recording of a web panel that I had with fellow co-authors of the book A Region in Revolt, Mapping the Recent Uprisings in North Africa and West Asia, edited by Jade. So the panel covered the 5 countries that are covered in the book. For Sudan, we had Sara, Abbas. For Algeria, Selma, Oumari. For Lebanon, myself and Jade Saab, the editor. For Iraq, Zeidon Alkinani. And for Iran, Frieda, Afary. The book covers the 2019 uprisings across the region, as I said, focusing on these 5 countries: Sudan, Algeria, Iraq, Lebanon and Iran. So as the book summary explains, we deal with these 5 countries as having similarities and differences. The mass protests in Algeria, Sudan, Iraq, Lebanon and Iran had much in common, from opposing authoritarian regimes and worsening economic situations to demanding radical changes in social relations. But despite these similarities, each protest movement operated under different conditions that cannot be ignored. The specific historic, political and economic context of each country have determined who the key actors of the uprisings are and their location across old and new divides. So I'm pleased to say that the book has been pretty well reviewed so far. We've had good reviews by Hafez Ngana, Gilbert Ashar, and Adam Haniyeh, which are also featured at the back of the book. And yeah, the conversation is about that. The conversation is about the book itself. If you're interested in either of the 5 countries or in the region in general, I think you'll find this an interesting conversation. And I will end by saying as well that this book would not have been possible without the Raja Press and the Transnational Institute. So that's it from me, folks. We'll be back in mid-January 2021. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the 35 patrons on patreon.com/firethesetimes. This project honestly wouldn't be possible without you, so thank you a lot for that. Wherever you are in the world, please stay safe. This has been a very difficult year, to put it very mildly. I can promise you that at least on my side, I will continue doing my best to engage in these very difficult yet important conversations in the year to come. Take care, everyone.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press. Welcome to the launch of A Region in Revolt, mapping the recent uprisings in North Africa and West Asia. This is a recently published book and has already had people write wonderful recommendations on it. For example, Hafez Ngana writes, it's an insightful, timely analysis of the uprisings in Sudan, Algeria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran. And Gilbert Ashkar writes, whereas there's a plethora of books on the 2011 upsurge, this book is the only comprehensive overview of the second wave of revolt, which is here analyzed from the standpoint of the popular struggle. And Adam Haniyeh writes a rich and informed account of the popular uprisings that have emerged across the Middle East and in recent years. I would like you to welcome our guests. Today, we have not all the contributors to the book, but many of them. And so let me quickly introduce the people who will be speaking today. The editor of this book is Jade Saab, who wrote on Lebanon as well, and he is a Lebanese Canadian writer and activist. We have Sara Abbas from Sudan, doing as a doctoral candidate in political science at the Free University of Berlin. Selma Oumari from Algeria, French Algerian, a member of the new anti-capitalist party. I'm sure there'll be a lot of interest in learning what the new anti-capitalist party is all about. Zeidon Alkinani will be speaking about Iraq, independent Iraqi-Swedish political researcher and analyst specializing in geopolitics. We will have Joey Ayoub, who will be the main speaker on the Lebanon chapter. He is a Lebanese Palestinian scholar, activist, and writer. And finally, we will have Frieda Afary talking about Iran. She's a librarian, translator, producer of the Iranian Progressives in Translation, and co-founder of the Alliance of Middle Eastern and North African Socialists. And I think it's quite an important thing to mention, because I think this book has its origins in the discussions within that alliance. So I'd like to welcome all of you. Welcome to the show. And I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Jade Saab, let's start with you. Why did you think it was necessary to produce this book? What was behind it?
And thanks for that, Feroz. It was quite a bit of a journey, actually, and it started, before the idea of the book. There was the Lebanese uprising, which we write about in the book, and that led me on to searching out people with similar viewpoints or similar ideas on what is happening in the region as a whole. Lebanon was the third, if not the fourth, in a series of new uprisings in the region. So I was seeking out voices, who are covering events in other countries to get a more regional perspective of what was happening. Through that, by happenstance, I stumbled across the Alliance of Middle Eastern and North African Socialists. I had a chat with Frieda and just started to familiarize myself with the works of the network. And I realized that this is just a great opportunity to bring people together to write about this in a timely manner, as it was still unfolding at the time. So that's kind of the narrative aspect of how this project came to be. The other one was bringing a perspective that is quite different as to how the first wave of protests were covered back in 2010 and 2011, and bringing in, really focusing on the movements themselves. What are their aspirations? What are their limitations? And analyzing them beyond kind of the coverage we had before on the role of social media, or breaking it down to simple things that made it seem that these uprisings are ahistorical or spontaneous. So we wanted to give every country its due in terms of the history of its struggles, as well as the movements on the ground and what their possibilities and potentials are.
So, but just quickly before we move on to listen to one of the other speakers, how did you avoid what is so common in these books about these struggles? Is that Orientalist lens? How did you conceive of avoiding that trap?
Yeah, that's definitely a big one, and I think we have to give credit here to all the writers. I mean, that's what makes this the work that it is. All of us are very active in the regions, in the countries we've written about. So we have that, insight to begin with. And the second is letting the movements speak for themselves, by giving this long view historical analysis at the beginning of each chapter or each section of the book. You allow people to see the complexity within each country and the history and the struggles of each country. You give it life, in a sense. And then by focusing on the main actors of the movement, as opposed to geopolitics, which is something that the region is many times reduced to, as power struggles between East and West and that kind of lens, just giving the space for the movements themselves, for the different actors, be it labor, be it women's struggles, be it minorities. So giving that depth in a accessible way still is the way I think we were able to avoid that.
I mean, one of the striking things about the way in which you put together the book what is the fact that each chapter begins, and it's very unusual, begins with a table of key events which go back into history. I mean, so it situates each event in the context of a long history. And I think one of the weaknesses, I think, when especially from the West, when it looks at the rest of the world, is to imagine that we have no history. And I think that's a very clever way of focusing attention and helping people acquire, albeit in very short, snappy ways, a history. So I mean, I'd like to really congratulate you for thinking that through, and each of you provided that in a wonderful way. So I'd like to move on to asking Sara Abbas perhaps to take us through a country in which enormous things have happened, enormous developments, and quite extraordinary developments. But yet there seems to be a blind spot in the media, and indeed on the left, I would say, about what I find in your description extraordinarily exciting evolution of a struggle that we could not even have dreamt of in a few years ago. And so I wonder if you'd like to help us understand that perspective.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm actually was very happy to be part of this project because one of the problems of the last 30 years of the al-Bashir regime was this kind of isolation that was imposed by the regime on the Sudanese, but also by sanctions from the US, from the West on the country. So kind of this dual move of the isolation of the regime itself and the sanctions, which have made it very, which have largely isolated us from much of the rest of the world and from the region. And I saw some similar dynamics as well in Frieda's chapter, so I always find it quite interesting to read about Iran. I think it's very interesting, actually, and one of the things that drew me to this project was the long view, because as you mentioned, Firoz, that region, as well as much of sub-Saharan Africa, is thought of as a kind of this place without a history, right? This colonial idea continues to persist. And I would say furthermore, in my discipline at least, which is political science, the Arab Spring, or the so-called Arab Spring, was treated as kind of like the beginning of history. And this was unfortunately internalized by a lot of analysts within the region itself. And of course, that boils down to this idea that peoples of those regions do this kind of dominant idea, this Orientalist lens that you mentioned, that they like authoritarianism. They don't know how to live or be governed without it. So I see a massive move and a massive change between then to now in the ways that we approach these movements. So when it comes to Sudan, I don't know how much I can shed light on it, but I think it's, I really hope that people read this book. Sudan, of course, something that is not very well known about it is that it has a very, very rich history of civil uprisings. So actually, the revolution in Tunisia and in Egypt was not as much of an earthquake in Sudan as it was elsewhere, partly because the Sudanese had seen these mass movements take down authoritarian regimes, specifically military dictatorships, both in 1964 and 1985. But of course, that set in motion regional dynamics that had also an influence many years later on the revolution that began in December 2018. And I think it's very interesting that this wave began in Sudan. I mean, Sudan is somewhat marginal to the region. It's a Black African nation that sits between these two kind of colonially constructed regions, the North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. the elites, whether civilian or military, have always tried to promote, if not impose at moments brutally, Arab identity, but it still remains kind of marginal to the region. So I think what we try, Azza, Mustafa and I, Azza Mustafa is the co-author, political scientist based in Sudan, what we try to do in this chapter is to really show the buildup of social movement work that resulted in what we would argue is one of the most sophisticated forms of organizing and mobilizing of social movements in this century. There has been a real high level of grassroots organizing and mobilizing that allowed these protests. There have been protests for many years in Sudan that have allowed these sparks to actually turn into this sustained resistance to the regime. At the same time, we want to be very careful for Sudan not to become the Tunisia of the second wave, meaning there has been a lot of analysis paid to the so-called failures of the first wave of uprisings. And of course, in this book, we reject this binary of success and failure. But Tunisia has always been posited as the success story, but we know that many of the demands of that revolution have not been actually fulfilled. And so what we also try to go through in this chapter, or at least reflect on in the conclusions, of course, is very early, but how is it that the counter-revolution actually works to attempt to dismantle even such a sophisticated level of organizing in Sudan, which worked at multiple levels between the trade unions, the Sudan Professionals Association, but also the grassroots resistance committees. I'm not going to go on much further because I know I only have 5 minutes, but I think it would be also interesting for us to not only try to draw the connections between the different chapters, which is, I think, what the real strength of this book is, but also to reflect slightly on some of the issues that we pick up on in the book, but perhaps are even more relevant now, which is speaking, for example, about the impact of COVID on this. And then for us, particularly in Sudan, as we see playing out right now, is the role of the international counter-revolutionary factors. So we try also in this book to break out of the idea of only analyzing the sort of local and national conditions, but really look at this very complex interplay between different, not just different levels of the revolution, but different levels of the counter-revolution as well.
I think that's really important. I think it's one of the strengths of each of the chapters in this book, and I think in particular in yours, it reminds me of Cabral's caution that it's not enough to just blame imperialism, and he says we have to remember that rice only cooks inside the pot, and so I think it is something important. I think your chapter helps enormously in understanding those movements and what is erupt. But I in my head I can't resolve the recent signature between Israel, the Zionist Israel, and the Sudanese regime. I mean, can you help us understand, in the context of all this enormous uprisings, incredible creativity, how is that possible?
Well, I'll give you my take on it. This is actually quite a contentious, as you can imagine, contentious topic, and some of us are also trying to wrap our heads around it. But one of the problems of the ways in which the al-Bashir regime functioned was that, and this we can see actually in the other chapters in the other countries as well, is the way that these regimes have attacked the international community. And by international community, I mean the West. So much was blamed on foreign agendas, Zionist agendas, and so forth. And I think while the Sudanese historically have always had been very steadfast on the issue of the Palestinian cause, what has happened is that one of the problems is that it has been set up almost that you have there's been this narrative that our welcoming back into the international community is going to resolve at least the economic crisis. And of course, the economic crisis has massively deepened in the last. I mean, it's always difficult to talk about economics in Sudan because every time you think you've hit the bottom of the barrel falls out. And so the economic issue was one of the biggest sparks for the revolution itself. So in the beginning, in the international media, the protests were reported as bread riots, right? So generally anything in relation to people of color or Black people or Africans is reported as riots, right? It's a way of kind of depoliticizing these movements. But the fact of the matter is, in response, there has been also a move to kind of downplay the economic factors, which are massive in Sudan. And the narrative that has been spun by the Sudanese elite, and I'm talking here civilian and military alike, has been that should we manage to remove sanctions on Sudan, which were partially removed already, but also if we manage to get out of this US state sponsors of terrorism list on which we have been since the 1990s, that somehow this will alleviate the economic crisis, which has reached really quite desperate levels. And so there has been this belief, or this, let's say there was a campaign that started a few months ago to promote the idea that we have to remove ourselves from this list at any cost. And of course, the cost has been quite high. Not to mention, in my humble opinion, it sets a very bad precedent. One of it is that we've paid hundreds of millions of dollars to the US in compensation for the victims of the USS Cole attack, as well as the victims of the embassy bombings in Tanzania and Kenya, the US embassy bombings. So this one of the poorest countries in the world is paying one of the richest countries hundreds of millions of dollars, right, at a time of deep economic crisis. And on top of it, the US threw into this deal the fact that you would have to also normalize relations with Israel. Now, the US is not the only player. In the Sudanese revolution, during the actual uprising and since, the role of Saudi Arabia and the UAE has been pivotal in the counter-revolution, and that continues. The military leadership within the government is very, very close to the UAE in particular, both to the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And of course, the UAE was normalizing relations with Israel. Now, the issue itself, the people who are against this normalization within Sudanese civil society are often accused of elitism, which has been one of the things that has been part of this coordinated campaign for normalization. But also, many people are questioning not necessarily the choice itself, but the fact that this unelected government, which to this day has not appointed a transitional legislative assembly, which is a key component of this transitional period, is making decisions on this. So internationally, for Israel, it's not just a question of legitimization. It's also a very important question in relation to its own internal politics, because Darfurian refugees, or refugees from the region of Darfur in Sudan, but also from other parts of Sudan, are one of the biggest groups of refugees in Israel, and have been treated really, really, really in brutal ways. And this is well documented by human rights organizations within Israel itself. And so Israel's interest in this is also for it to be able to get rid of what it calls its infiltrator problems, because they're not called refugees, they're called infiltrators. So you see this kind of, I would say, the coming together of the Sudanese elite, both the civilian and the military, along with these international agendas in relation to the legitimization of Israel, but also the UAE's influence over the military, and that's how you end up with this decision. In theory, the decision is not formalized yet. The upcoming assembly would formalize it, but the government is already acting in this as though the normalization is law. So I would say that it is a done deal unless something happens between now and when this legislative assembly would vote on it.
Right. Okay, that's a very, very useful highlight. Let's turn to Algeria. You know, people of my generation cut their teeth in the Algerian Revolution, and to see it arising again. But the creativity of the recent uprisings has been quite extraordinary. So let me turn to Selma Oumari. Perhaps you can help us understand the nature of this extraordinary uprising.
Yes, sure. Thank you for the invitation. Just to precise, I currently live in Paris. The New Anti-Capitalist Party is an organization who is in France. So what's the relationship with Algeria? You might know it a bit, but the organization's history has been committed to fight for the liberation also of Algeria under the colonialist rule. So there is this always this relationship of solidarity and struggle from France to Algeria, and this is the history in which many people here, Algerians living in France, are still in. So concerning the Hirak itself, actually, the first thing I would like to acknowledge is that the Sudanese, in the timing, the Sudanese rise up and also showed the way to the Algerians who started their Hirak. Now that we can see that we live in a world with mass uprising, it's very important to document them, to show the history where it comes from, and to understand what's happening today in Algeria, what brought the people to protest against the regime, to denounce the military regime, is also the result of a long history of struggles that very few people know. Very few people have informations from everything that happened since the independence, and that's what the chapter is about. Unity between the class needed to be built on a long-term basis. We show that many social movements, many trade union movements and strikes as well, cultural also, discussions about what it means to be Algerian, because we had a history of this, and it had divided Algerians for a long time between the Amazigh, the original culture, the Amazigh identity, and the Arab identity, and the French heritage. Where so all this shows that the identity is very complex, and it was a very important element in which I would say that people had lots of fights. There were like the state actually tried to bind and censor the Amazigh identity since the independence, just to assert that Algeria is an Arab country, which is not just that. I think the same thing that that Sudan is experiencing, and so we've been beyond that, and this is what also allowed more unity among the people to face also their, I would say, their oppressors, and that's an important element. So in the chapter you have the cultural side, but you also have the economic situation, and I think the goal with Hamza Hamouchene, who contributed to the article, is to is not just to explain the internal economic situation, but to understand the internal economic situation and the crisis Algeria is witnessing, the economic crisis Algeria is witnessing. You have to link it with the way the global economy is organized and the role of Algeria within it, and especially the choice of the ruling class to submit to the international economical rules of the market, which means providing I don't know the wording. I forgot the word. But providing, I mean, like providing oil and gas roughly in low prices, just it was the main, I would say, was the main economic activity, and it is submitted to the global economy as well as many other aspects of it. So the question of what do we do with our what do we do with our natural resources was key. And linked to that also, it's not just an economic question as we see. It's a balance of forces globally, but also internally, and even the revenues of the oil and gas is, I would say, just taking over by the ruling class, which is mostly composed by the military. Just to say it roughly, and the whole question of national sovereignty over these resources is also raised, and it is a very sensitive question in Algeria, and it was an important motto in the massive Hirak movement that we have witnessed, because it dwells in a long history of resisting colonialism, and in a way, after the independence, it has been translated, especially within this movement, into what I would say a reappropriation of a common power over the states. So this is the way that we, in the chapter, this is the way we mostly try to explain how we came to a situation in which such a movement was erupted, such massive demonstration all throughout the country erupted, and also the halting since the COVID crisis, which actually put a momentum to the movement. But still, we don't know what's happening, because as we said also in the chapter, there are resistance within the movement, because the military is now banning and imprisoning journalists, activists, and so there are also movements to oppose that. Until now, it is the kind of tension that is happening, because they are trying to profit from the COVID crisis to censor and imprison the people.
Right. Well, I mean, we'll talk a lot about the sort of commonalities that you've referred to, and I think one of the things that's emerging is the impact of COVID is something I think we will need to perhaps open up a discussion during the round table part. But thank you for that elaboration of the situation. Perhaps we could turn to discussing the situation in Iraq. Zeidon Alkinani, would you be up for giving us a quick update on that?
Sure. Thank you, Feroz. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone. We just met today online for the first time. Well, at least I did. Before I move locally into speaking about the Iraq case that I was responsible for in this book, I would like to talk about the regional commonalities, since we're talking about the MENA protest movements. And one of the most interesting things that I realized and observed personally before we even started this book is that the second wave of the MENA protest, or the second wave of the Arab Spring, like a lot of people would like to call, but it doesn't really have that notion for many reasons, is that we witnessed that the protest movements in this book did skip or try to avoid the mistakes or the unfortunate challenges that a lot of the uprisings had to fall into, or the traps they had to fall into during the Arab Spring. There was a lot of awareness. There was a lot of youth awareness and momentum regarding to ensure that no political agendas would be able to take an advantage of an empty platform that is led by a grassroots, youth-led protest movement. There was a lot of awareness about avoiding any sort of political discourse that would promote or encourage moving from a peaceful uprising to an armed rebellion. Although a lot of the uprisings in the MENA region fell into that without the actual protest movement welcoming it. There was a lot of care from the regional power players. They weren't as keen in getting involved or interfering, just like they used to in the Arab Spring. Maybe they did so more in Iraq than the other protests in this book. I also like to look at the similarities between some of the countries. Lebanon and Iraq shared a very similar challenge that both protest movements were rising against, and that is the muhasasa, which is known as the ethnic sectarian quota that was imposed on the people, where they distribute or share the powerful positions and ministries to political parties based on their ethnic sectarian distribution or division, instead of their experience or qualifications to have those positions. Iraq was also a victim of the Iran-backed militias that are in Iraq and that are the armed wings of the most powerful political parties in government. Those are the very same Iran backed militias that were targeting and killing and assassinating and intimidating the protesters in Iran. So you can see a lot of similarities between two different nations that have probably a very different struggle, but it's also very similar at the same time. Moving to Iraq, at least I tried to do it in 4 different ways. I looked at it from 4 different angles. I did it in a gradual order. And that was, I began with the pre-2003 historical roots. And I remember I gave Jade such a hard time because I gave him a chapter that was 80% of Iraq's history rather than the actual October uprising. Another element of looking at it is the post-2003 Iraq dynamics. By post-2003 Iraq, we mean the new Iraq, which we saw after the US occupation in 2003. And then we look at the 2015 onwards protest movement, which I'll talk later a bit into depth later on if I have time. And then finally, I talk about the October uprising, or the revolution, if you want to call it that, as a separate concept that probably doesn't have anything to do with those 3 previous periods or eras. One of the interesting things that a lot of observers and analysts or people even noticed about the October 2019 uprising in Iraq is that it occurred or emerged in the southern provinces and the capital. And the southern provinces, interestingly enough, is mostly inhabited by the Shia population, or the community, which the government that is led by the Shia political parties claims to represent, claims to defend, claims to serve. The South, historically, when I pulled the socioeconomic indicators before 2003 into today's uprising, I look at how the South, or the southern community, always have that history of victimization. They have always been marginalized by the Ottoman rule, later by the British Mandate, which also witnessed a tribal rebellion led by the tribal leaders of the South. And then later on, the marginalization and the struggle and the repression they faced by the Ba'athist regime from 1963 up until 2003. And then I moved from a post-2003 Iraq perspective. As a lot of us know, it's a natural response to the new Iraq that was imposed on the Iraqi people. Regardless of people's stance towards Saddam Hussein, we witnessed a lot of people, many Iraqis, if not most Iraqis, who did not enjoy Saddam's dictatorship, but also did not enjoy the US occupation. That is the very same political or superpower that armed Saddam, funded Saddam in his war against Iran, and now they decided to replace him by the political opposition, which they wanted to impose on the Iraqi people without any elections, which I also mention in my chapter. And then I talk about the 2015 to the onwards protest movement, which began in 2015. And that was, we could say that was the first time we witnessed a transition from identity politics to issue politics in Iraq. Iraqis were no longer interested in knowing who the new Kurdish president is. They were no longer interested in who is the new Sunni Speaker of Parliament. They were more interested in knowing if the unemployment rates are going to keep increasing. They were more interested in knowing if electricity and water is going to continue to be absent from the next government. There was a frustration with the war with ISIS. ISIS came into Iraq in 2014. So in 2015, a lot of people were protesting against this government that claims to be fighting ISIS in 2014, and that also claimed to be fighting the Shia militias in 2008, and that also claimed to be fighting Al-Qaeda in 2004. Now, of course, we're not denouncing the violence from these extremist groups, but what we're denouncing is that when is the government going to actually work for the people? When is the government going to work on rebuilding and reconstructing the healthcare system, the education, the infrastructure? Are we just going to keep on fighting? Are we just going to keep on witnessing sectarian political violence? Is this what the post-2003 Iraq is for? And then finally, I talk about the October uprising. But I have to confess that I was one of the people who used to call it the October Revolution. But thanks to Jade, in a conversation with him, he made me notice that it's an uprising rather than a revolution. Well, he didn't say it, but he made me notice that. He reflected and emphasized on it. And I guess from a geopolitical perspective, it's hard to call the revolution in Iraq a revolution. It might be culturally and politically, but because it only occurred and emerged in the southern provinces where most of the population is and the capital, and it wasn't in the western or in the northern Kurdish areas, we have to call it an uprising, and it might be a political revolution rather than a geographical revolution, because I guess we all agree, well, I don't want to enforce on what you agree, but we all probably think that a revolution should be widespread. It's a mass campaign. Finally, my last words is that I look at the October uprising, which we in Arabic called Thawrat Tishrin or Intifada Tishrin. It was the most widespread protest movement in Iraq. It was the most evident and present role of Iraq's youth in Iraq's history. We saw 14-year-olds, 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, unemployed graduates and students and different labor unions trying to finally determine what is best for their country. We saw a very new sentiment, which is the anti-Iran sentiment. By anti-Iran, we mean the anti-Iran backed militias in Iraq, and not Iran as a country, not Iran as a population or the nation. The people of Iraq realize and are aware that the struggles of the Iranian people are the same struggles of the Iraqi people against the very same interest groups that are backed by the very same political powers in this world. I try to connect these four different factors, but I also try to give the October uprising its very own character, a character that was also intensified by the response of the government in early October 2019. The more we realized that the more violence they were receiving, the more intimidation, the more assassinations. There were around 800 people who died, 800 peaceful protesters who got killed by the militias or the police forces, armed forces. We realized that the more violence, the more struggle, the more the identity of the October uprising becomes stronger, the more people joins them on the street. People were no longer protesting against the Iraqi government, but they were also protesting against the religious establishment. They were protesting against the sectarian discourse that was adapted, promoted, and supported by many private organizations, religious or political or even economic, beyond the political system, beyond the official political system. We like to call it in Arabic Dawla al-Amiqa, which means the deep state, and that is basically a network of interest groups that consists of political parties that are not necessarily in the government, but they probably have much more power than the political parties or the politicians in government. I hope I didn't cross my 5 minutes. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, no, well, thank you very much. I mean, it just strikes me, this is another area where we see silences, which this book has helped break. And that is, there's very little understanding about what has happened in terms of uprisings in Iraq. It's still seen as internecine killings. And so I think there's some very important dimensions in that chapter. This issue of revolt, revolution, if one sees revolution as an event, a singular event, I think, you know, maybe you're right, and it's not the right way to call it. But if one sees it as a what is happening is maybe Act 2 of Scene 1, and it's the ongoing story. It hasn't finished. So you know, I'm always wary about these discussions about is it or is it not. It's evolving, and and we'll see where it goes. Let's move to Lebanon, and we have Joey Ayoub, a Lebanese Palestinian scholar, and activist, and writer. Joey, would you like to give us an update on this?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, very good.
Okay. So first, thank you for having me, and thank you for putting me after Iraq, because I think some of the similarities between Lebanon and Iraq are actually very interesting to look at, although Iraq has suffered at a much greater scale. We don't have anywhere near the amount of casualties, for example. Jade and I, one of the unfortunate issues when writing a book, which is the same issue when writing any article, is you have to stop somewhere. And in the case of Lebanon, unfortunately, we had to stop before the August explosion. Now, I don't think our analysis would have necessarily changed, because we focused on the end of 2019 and early 2020. But the August explosion sort of gave for me anyway, personally, I don't know if Jade would agree, kind of a different feel to what's been happening. And the urgency of the protests in October 2019, in some ways, were revealed much later, which for the bad luck of protesters in Lebanon happened in the middle of COVID-19, obviously, and so which had slowed down significantly the protests in the country prior to August. And so there is this difficulty always as to when to start and when to end. But what we try to do is to give, obviously, as well, a historical overview. And Lebanon happens to have kind of a cycles of 15 years, more or less. So if you start in 75, although we also mentioned briefly the history before 75, but without civil war in 75, it lasted until 1990. It's actually multiple wars within one, but people call it the civil war to just simplify it a bit. And then from 90 to 2005, you had what you might call the post-war reconstruction era, which never really ended after either, but that's sort of in the 90s when it was its heyday, let's say. And after 2005, the assassination of the Prime Minister, Revolt Hariri, you had the formation of this binary, the March 8 versus March 14 binary, which are two rival political movements. Although various people have argued, and I agree with that it's more of a placeholder, name holder more than anything else, because they're actually not necessarily opposed to one another. They actually depend on one another quite a lot. And this is where some of the comparisons with Iraq would come in as well, because you would have on the one hand, the movements that are pro-Saudi Arabia actually being pretty cozy with the movements that are pro-Iran. In this case, I'm mentioning the Hariri's movement and Hezbollah. So the protests in Lebanon started in October, but they didn't start only in October. October was kind of just the straw that broke the camel's back, as that expression has been repeated too many times by now. And what we saw since then are really different waves. I also agree with the wariness of having a very strict distinction between a revolution and uprising, and that's why in the book we call it like the dual nature of the Lebanese uprising, because we agreed that there is a revolutionizing, if you want, a revolutionary dimension to the uprising, although we would also agree that in many ways it's simply not over. Now, any uprising, I think, regardless of how you call it, has always a fragile dimension to it, in the sense that there are just too many actors and too many factors to take into account, which always resists the sort of oversimplification that we might see in these types of books, which is what obviously we try to avoid, which is why I think I actually enjoyed reading it as well, not just writing it. I enjoyed reading the other chapters. So I don't want to overstep my time too much. All I'll say is that there is much to come, I think, in the case of from within Lebanon, that are very, very difficult to predict and very difficult to analyze in advance, obviously, for obvious reasons. And there will be many factors to come, first of which probably is the economic crisis, which is still ongoing and which is likely to be ongoing, which is likely to continue for quite some time. And if we agree, and I think panelists here would probably agree, that the root causes of the uprising were primarily economic and sectarianism and all of that in the case of Lebanon, those problems are very much still there in Lebanon, and they've, by any measure, have gotten significantly worse. So I think it's fair to say that if we if all of these factors had led to October 2019, I personally would think that something else is going to come along the way, although the form in which it might manifest itself obviously is impossible to say.
Yeah. Well, that's very helpful. Yeah, we can't predict the future, but certainly we can learn from the developments of the events at the moment. And I think there'll be a lot of questions in the round table around both meaning of that big explosion, but also the parallels with what has happened in Palestine. Maybe it's an area where we have been, might perhaps also have had a chapter. Let me move on to Frieda, Afary, to speak about really interesting work on Iran, and again opening up, moving the blinds from the situation in Iran. I think was very helpful to overcome some of the silences that we experienced. So, Frieda, a warm welcome to you.
Thank you. So, first of all, I want to thank Darja Press, Feroz, and Jade Saab for making this book possible. And I especially want to thank Jade for his amazing, wonderful questions that really helped us write our chapters. I mean, I told him that I just followed through on his questions, and there I had chapters. So thank you, Jade. We are facing a war on Iran by Israel, the US, Saudi Arabia, that has been going on for a long time, and it's had another stage opening up with the assassination of the Iranian nuclear weapons scientist Fakhrizadeh 3 days ago, and remains to be seen what will happen, because Iran has promised to take revenge, and last time it promised to take revenge, it brought down a plane with 176 passengers, mostly Iranians, over Iran's territory. So it's very important to talk about regional and international solidarity, anti-war, anti-imperialist regional and international solidarity. And this book can truly help us if we follow through on its content. So to say a bit about the chapter that I wrote on Iran, first, I have tried to establish the facts about the November 2019 uprising that involved at least a couple of 100,000 people. It was a working class revolt with young people and women in the forefront. And I try to connect it both going back to the December 2017, January 2018 uprising, which was also working class, also had women and youth in the forefront. And I go forward to the January 2020 protests against the Iran bringing down, shooting down the plane with 176 passengers, and all the protests that resulted from that against war and against dehumanization and against and what I single out is that these uprisings, they've all been against both the Iranian regime's exploitation of Iranian people and its social injustice domestically, and also against Iran's regional imperialist interventions in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Yemen. And that's been a really important dimension of these uprisings, both the one that started in 2017 and the one that started in 2019. So that's the first point that I established. Secondly, I try to clarify the character of the Iranian regime as a militarized state capitalism with regional imperialist interventions and ambitions, but also a regime that uses an anti-imperialist language, has used it from the beginning, from 1979, when the Islamic fundamentalist faction or portion of the opposition took over the revolution and gave it an Islamic fundamentalist character. And it has used an anti-imperialist language from the beginning. The third point that I try to establish is, I try to discuss various forces of revolt in Iran, who they are, the labor struggles, the women feminist struggles, the oppressed minorities, Arabs, Kurds, as well as religious minorities such as the Baha'is and the Sufis, the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender activist struggles, the student youth activities and efforts to connect with other struggles, the environmental struggles, and the political prisoners. That represents all the struggles that I just mentioned. And I'd be happy to say more about them when we discuss this book further. The next point that I try to establish is what are both some of the possibilities and the limitations of these struggles and these forces, and of Iranian socialists, as small as they are. I also look at some of the lessons that we can learn from the 1979 revolution and address three main problems. One is within Iranian society at large and among Iranian socialists. One is the problem of statism, having an alternative to capitalism that doesn't really go beyond state capitalism. Two is nationalism, specifically Iranian nationalism. And three is sexism and misogyny, which is still quite prevalent within socialists as well. And then the last point that I try to discuss is the need for regional and global solidarity. And on the one hand, we see the MENA uprisings, which are really amazing and create new possibilities for regional solidarity. On the other hand, we see, unfortunately, the majority of global socialists, not all, but the majority, still go by the anti-imperialist language that the Iranian government uses to say that either they should support the Iranian regime against US and Israeli and Saudi Arabian imperialism, or that Iran is just the lesser of the two evils, or the lesser of the various evils. So that continues to be a problem. And so instead of actually siding with the struggles inside Iran, we see siding with the Iranian regime. And but at the same time, I think that within the MENA region, I think we too are to be blamed for not engaging the global struggles enough. Specifically, what for the current moment, the Black Lives Matter struggle, Black Lives Matter uprising in the US, the abolitionist struggle, and the women's liberation struggles, most specific manifestation of it, the Me Too movement, that we too need to engage those more. And we do have Me Too struggles inside the region as well. And lately we've had a budding Me Too movement in Iran. So there are a lot of possibilities that we can work with. And hopefully this chapter can create a basis for a lot more discussion and real activity of solidarity. So that's all I have to say for now. As far as COVID is concerned, I'd be happy to talk more about it in the discussion. Yes, COVID has severely damaged Iran. In fact, in the region, I think Iran has had the worst COVID case with massive deaths and at least half the population is infected at this point by some estimates. So at the time we have COVID, we also have this current situation of political prisoners worsening. political prisoners are dying in prison, catching COVID, or being executed. So we need to talk about all of that.
Great, thank you. Well, I think that opens up a number of issues. I'm going to see if I have you on the screen at the same time. And perhaps to sort of kick off, let me take a question that's been posed by Bill Fletcher Jr., who's been doing this. He writes, do the authors believe that the current breakdown in the ceasefire between Polisario and Morocco is part of the second wave? There are various observers who would argue that the 2010 Sahrawi protests represented, along with the Iranian Green Movement, the beginning of uprisings in 2011. Anyone want to respond to Bill Fletcher's question?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the whole question. You got cut off. Can you read that again?
Yes. I mean, basically saying, do you all believe that the current breakdown in the ceasefire between Polisario and Morocco is part of the second wave that accompanies the second wave, which has been described in this book? Any comments? Yes, Sara.
I mean, the coverage that I'm seeing of it is very much mainstream media coverage. So it's very hard to formulate a feeling about the current breakdown in the ceasefire. I know that Polisario is saying that it's withdrawing from the ceasefire. There's been a lot of movement there also in reaction by the Moroccan government. I think it opens up the possibilities. For me, one way in which it could become part of this wave is if it also manages to connect with some of the social movements within Morocco. So, for example, I've always felt that Morocco didn't get enough of a place within the first wave with the 20th of February movement that took place in 2011, and which the monarchy in Morocco managed to sort of masterfully diffuse that movement. But also, very interestingly, the Hirak movements, the Hirak that has been taking place in the Rif region of Morocco, in 2016 and 2017 especially, with really powerful movements that took place, which were met with a lot of a brutal response by the Moroccan regime. So it's difficult to see where this is going, but what is interesting, or at least what I'm looking for alternative and media on this, is to see what is, because the way it's reported in the international media is very much about the Polisario and the regime and the Moroccan regime, rather than to understand how this plays into the social movement dynamics more broadly, but also whether they are able to connect with these social movements within Morocco, which have been flaring up and bubbling up under the surface for the last 10 years, actually, since the first wave. And so I guess that's not really a full answer, but it's something in relation to this.
I can give some elements of understanding that. I think we can't understand why there is a break of the ceasefire also if we don't get to know that this kind of I would say conflicts that are happening are also deeply linked with the economic crisis and the effects of the COVID-19. Why am I saying that? Is that several little wars are re-erupting. They were there, like for example the Artsakh conflict. It was always there for a long time. It's still an issue of territories, of self-determinations of the people living there, and so the Polisario issue is also re-erupting. But the conflict was still there because, like, the Sahrawi people have been colonized by the Moroccan regime and are trying to resist the same way that in a more radical way or different way than the RIF, because they want to achieve independence and they want their republic to be settled, while Morocco is denying their sovereignty. They're taking over the natural resources, and there is this fight for natural resources that is still happening, and so they are benefiting for the current crisis, and also for the lack of resources they are trying to grab on. Like the Moroccan regime is trying to grab on more and more, the same way Israel does on Palestine, and the same way, in my opinion, like Azerbaijan is trying to do, to entrench one of the few places where resistance is, and also that's what they are doing to the RIF people, to Moroccan people in the RIF who were politically imprisoned. They are trying to move on, to move on their side, to make sure that there won't be any resistance against as well. So the question of the Polisario is still very tense, and it also raised diplomatic issues with Algeria, because Algeria is backing the Polisario movement, part for, I would say, geostrategical reasons, but also part of the history of supporting, I would say, like oppressed nations, the same way they support, the Palestinian people. You have this feeling of also supporting the people in southern Sahara.
I mean, many of you have mentioned COVID as something that is something to be dealt with, and I mean, one of the things certainly in many African countries that I've been told about in a series of interviews I did was people talk about it as a revelation, as removing some of the veils around our eyes to be able to better understand the nature of the societies in which we live. To what extent then do you feel that COVID is also playing that role in terms of revealing more clearly the class nature of the state and its response to the pandemic? To what extent is it affecting the direction and potentials of the movements that have arisen in each of these countries?
I can start. Sure. I mean, in the case of Lebanon, it's pretty stark. It's pretty obvious. There's been no real organized response to COVID-19 on the part of the government. It's been largely some segments of the public sector in coordination with medical workers that also work in the private sector, which has created a lot of problems, to put it very, very mildly, because in the same time period, the government has just been focusing on reinstating its reputation in the quote-unquote international community, namely especially with France and the West and so on. The class distinctions in Lebanon, obviously they've always been there, but yeah, I do agree, at least to a certain extent, they have been exposed for what they've always been in the case of the country, and I'm guessing in the rest of the world it's kind of the similar situations we've been seeing. But yes, at least as far as Lebanon is concerned, it's definitely highlighted, for example, the fact that there's no universal healthcare in the first place, and this is something that is costing a lot of lives, quite a lot of lives right now, and we can't even rely on official figures for the most part.
Jade, let me ask you, because you edited this book and you brought these amazing people together. Looking at that, how do you see this playing out? What is COVID telling us about our societies?
I wanted to, before answering that question, follow up on something Joey said, and I see a similar pattern in Lebanon, and maybe it's not a very optimistic pattern, with how the population at large, the movement, was impacted by COVID, as well as how it was impacted later on by the explosion. Whenever Lebanon faces some kind of massive crisis, we see it automatically being deferred to either private sector actors or non-governmental organizations as well, which as good intentioned as they are, is of course to kind of plug a gap that the state is not dealing with or not acting, also creates a depoliticizing process, while at the same time creating a window for political parties in Lebanon to enter the scene and reinvigorating their kind of clientelist networks. So as soon as COVID started, you saw all these political parties who are responsible essentially for the degradation of our health system jump into action, spread on social media the pictures of their party members in protective equipment, going around disinfecting towns, etc. So it has a double effect where, yes, it intensifies the crisis, but at the same time, it re-lends some kind of legitimacy to the system itself, either through the intervention of NGOs or through this cantonization of Lebanon, where you have these political parties jump into action as the proper representatives of the interest of the people in each section of the society. So you've definitely had a double process, and with somewhere like Lebanon, and it would be great to hear from Zeidon if it's the same in Iraq. This sectarian system has always been a way to divide the working class and to create a solid basis of class conflict or class struggle. I mean, the class conflict is there, but genuine proletarian class struggle against the ruling class. So as with everything, it is more complex than just how it functions, like how, a clear direction. On a global scale and in the region, it is a crisis. It is a crisis, and at the same time, we've seen how that's impacted the accumulation of wealth for a very few, while others, especially those who are considered as essential workers. I'm based in the UK. We have the NHS here. The only thing they've been given is claps at certain times at night, as to show this essential worker, this myth that then develops around it. Also meant to remove or depoliticize the economic aspects of a crisis such as this. Again, most of the ruling classes in the regions covered in this book don't have the healthcare and don't care to provide the healthcare for people, and we have seen it acting as a radicalizing element, at the same time acting as a justification to bring in the army. For the example of Lebanon, the army was mobilized to impose lockdown and to suppress the movements themselves. It's hard to say, maybe after this there will be a reinvigoration, a more radical street movement that adds to its list of things the government has messed up, essentially the response to COVID. But so far, I'd say COVID has tipped the balance in favor of the ruling classes, who have been able to mobilize against the street
Sara,
movements.
do you see the same manifestation in Sudan? We can't hear you.
One thing that has happened under this transitional government, or what we call the civilian component of this transitional government, is they've responded to demands to increase spending on health, education, particularly these two. I mean, Sudan is a country that under the former regime, at least 70 to 75% of its budget went to defense and security, right? So if you look at the new budget, it's much better in the sense that they've increased on paper, they've increased spending. The problem is that actually the Sudanese Minister of Health who has lost his job since, was heavily critiqued at the beginning of the pandemic for going on TV and saying, look, if you don't observe the lockdowns and if you don't prevent yourself from being infected, the best we can do for you, and maybe not even that, is to put you give you some oxygen, but there's nothing we can do for you. And that was a really interesting moment, because what actually infuriated the elites was not the problem itself. but the fact that he spoke about it openly, okay? And it sort of boils, I mean, there was more rage that he sort of made the country look bad than the fact that there is such a situation going on in the country where your Minister of Health is telling you that basically you're going to die if you get COVID. But the interesting thing is that I would say this transitional period, some effort has been made at legal reform, I would say very progressive legal reform. Some effort has been made at changing the budgets or rebudgeting, reallocating budgets. The problem is there has been very little effort made to actually address the economic structure. And the economic structure remains such, I mean, I think about Algeria, also the chapter on Algeria, this extractive relationship that we have with our resources, number one. So what do we supply? We still supply only raw materials to the rest of the world. Secondly, most of this, for example, one of the biggest sources since the loss of the oil revenues in 2011, or much of the oil revenues to South Sudan, the regime, the al-Bashir regime was saved temporarily by the emergence of gold. Sudan has some of the biggest gold deposits in the world. And these gold deposits remain under the control of the Rapid Support Forces militia, the Janjaweed militia that's now part of the governance. It is under the control of, 50, 80. People are still trying to map the amount of companies or front companies that own these mines. There have been mass sit-ins across the country in different places since the transition, right? Since the beginning of the transition, where people have demanded that they gain control over these resources, or that at least the government would strip these resources away. So you ended up, for example, with the lockdown situation. I I'm in touch with the Union of Tea and Food Sellers, which are some of the most marginalized women in the urban areas who are displaced by war from Darfur, from Blue Nile, from Nuba Mountains, some of the richest areas of the countries in terms of resources and the poorest in terms of the population, and who are also racialized, right? They are non-Arabs and racialized within that matrix. And the lockdowns, there was an attempt to impose the lockdown on them with absolutely no provision whatsoever for their well-being, or for the fact that if these women do not go to the market or on the street, they cannot actually earn and survive, right? So for much of the poor, COVID itself has not been the biggest problem. The biggest problem is, how do we eat? I mean, there's less of a concern about catching it and more of a concern about the fact that the ways that it's changed the economic landscape has made it even more impossible to survive economically. It has also been interesting because the very elites usually do not get medical treatment in the country. They go elsewhere. Jordan, Egypt, the very wealthy go to the UK. And it's been really interesting for them because unless you own a dual passport, this is the first time in which they have not been able to get on a plane and go. And so that has also kind of been interesting to watch, this kind of paralysis of, my God, we have to use this health system, this same health system, even though you have layers of it. But even the best private hospitals in Sudan are in many ways death traps, right? There's a saying in Sudan that if you're ill and you go into a hospital, you will probably die. And if you're okay, you will get ill. So for the first time, many of them have had to actually face this issue. So I think the budgetary allocations are a good move, but at the same time, if there is no real attempt to challenge the structure of ownership of resources, the fact that so much of these resources are being funneled out of the country, I think it's been a problem. And we don't have many doctors. Many of our doctors already work abroad because it's one of the professions people are attracted to because it gives you some route out of the country, right? And many of the doctors who are working, we have, just in the last weeks, we've lost many doctors in this wave of COVID. And of course, the numbers don't look bad because there's so little testing already, right? So we don't know. I mean, so if you talk to most people, they say COVID is their least problem, actually, right now, And so it has highlighted, I would say, these differences, but it has also, I would add, it has also exacerbated them, particularly when it comes to the effect on the poorest that rely on the informal market, which is the majority of the population, actually.
Right. I mean, the whole topic of the impact of COVID on each of these countries is something I would love to have another session on, and we're coming quite close towards the end of the program. But the question I'd like to pose to you, each of you, so as to round this this discussion up, is that what can you sort of highlight for me 2 or 3 major things that you learned from reading the other chapters? In what way were your eyes opened in that? In other words, I'm looking for a sort of synthesis of those perceptions in that. Maybe we can start with you, Frieda.
Similarities. Okay, so a few points. I mean, there's a lot to be said. These are just some that come to mind. The similarities between Sudan and Algeria. Movements challenging both military governments and religious fundamentalism. And the importance of the role of women in both, and they need to really build on that. And that I think should be one of our projects, to build on what the strong participation of women in those uprisings has meant. When it comes to Iraq and Lebanon, I think again struck me that they both share this aspect of struggling against sectarianism, governments that are based on ethnic division or a quota system based on ethnicity. And again, there too, in the case of Iraq, I think I was interested in how the Shia masses really, in really important way, broke with the not totally, but in an important way, broke with the domination of the Hezbollah and rose up against the internal exploiter. Instead of constantly following the slogans of anti-imperialism and not addressing the internal exploitation and internal struggles. But I am still waiting to see how there can be connections with the Kurdish struggle in Iraq. I think that remains to be seen, and it's a real lack that hasn't been created, that the Kurds weren't strong participants in the uprising. And what can be done about that? When it comes to Lebanon, I think what needs to be further developed is the role of women. And let's not forget that Lebanese women did that beautiful dance of following through on what the Chilean women did, the song and dance, A Rapist in Your Way. That they were the only ones in the region who did that, and that's tremendous. Lebanon has a very strong feminist struggle that needs to be built on, and that was a very important part of the uprising. So those are issues that I wanted to single out about the other countries.
Thank you, Frieda. Zeidon, what about you? What struck you?
Yes, of course. I did mention the similarities earlier. I'll mention them again and add a few others. But yeah, just like Frieda mentioned, Iraq and Lebanon, the muhasasa, the ethno-sectarian system. I was having a conversation before the protests, actually in summer 2019, with some Lebanese people in Lebanon, and I was with an Iraqi, and we were having the conversation with 2 Lebanese women. And the interesting part we felt is that because the ethno-sectarian system in Lebanon has been there for such a longer time, so it kind of has normalized it amongst the Lebanese community. They don't see it in a similar aggressive and frustrating way like we do in Iraq, because we're new to it. So we just, we live in this dilemma that it's a temporary thing that will disappear one day. Whereas in Lebanon, it's been there for a longer period. It's more established, and it was also kind of seen as the alternative, as a ceasefire to stop a very bloody civil war. Whereas in Iraq, it occurred out of nowhere. Like, it probably was there politically prepared during the early stages of the occupation, but no one really thought that that is what democracy is going to be all about. So people didn't really have enough time to, let's say, protest against it or even understand where it's going to lead us, unless it was people who had a very close eye to what Lebanon is all about, and they realized that this is just a replica happening again in Iraq. One interesting thing about Iraq and Sudan, and sorry, Selma, this is not about your chapter, this is just something that I've recently discovered now, is that I found it very interesting about the Israeli ambitions towards the future Sudan and the future Iraq, as if the people in Sudan and Iraq were protesting against unemployment and violence and frustrations with their system just because they want to develop some relations with Israel. So that was a bit frustrating to witness, that Israel tries to take an advantage of two strong people but weak countries that are trying to develop their own living standards in their own ways, and not trying to ignore the struggles of the Palestinian people and build relations with Israel. But others might disagree with me. Iraq and Algeria, I would say the main similarity would be that card that the government always use about the public fear of religious fundamentalism coming up if we lose the army or if we lose the government, and that if the Algerian government or the system or the police force loses control over Algeria, if the same thing happens in Iraq, then we have all these extremist groups that are going to take over Iraq, and ignoring the thousands of academics and scholars and activists and public servants that could build a better future for both countries. And I guess that's it, the similarities.
What about you, Selma? I saw you shaking your head in relation to.
Yes, that's it. I was really inspired by the similarities between Iraq and Algeria, but I would like also to acknowledge the fact that the way you fought against sectarianism is also very inspiring for us, because Algeria is known mostly as Sunni in majority, Muslim Sunni, and it seems that from outside that we don't have issue between us, but actually we do have. And in the definition also of Algerian nationalities, as a result of colonialism, you have the fact that we are automatically Muslims. So the question of religious freedom, even within Islam, is raised, and we still have in Algeria lots to learn about religious freedom and stand in solidarity with people who, just want to define themselves the way they are. And it's a kind of, despite the fact that it's not really written in the law, not as clearly as in Iraq or even in Lebanon, still you have this issue that needs to come out, especially because more and more migrants are living in Algeria, and so you have also this especially anti-Black racism, and one of the elements of the anti-Black racism is also based on religious hatred. So that's why we need to understand that it's not because you live in a country with supposed to be historically Muslims that you reject all parts, all differences, all different religious trends that actually exist, but some of them, are hidden, like Christians still in Algeria are, very oppressed, very especially by the controlled by the state, and so there is no clear, even in the movement we still not have this clear expression of that. So I think that's why the articles on Lebanon and the chapters, on Lebanon and Iraq are essential. Concerning Sudan, I found, as we said in the article, we really need to learn on how we need to self-organize ourselves, because the Iraq was a kind of spontaneous movement, but it was structured around weekly demonstration, and it had to halt because of the COVID. But how do you also manage to build more a stronger trade union organization, even political organizations. Still, there are political organizations in Algeria that are trying to structure, but it's still too weak. And so the role of organization within the revolution is key if you want to achieve something. And the case of Sudan shows that without these structures, as well as the movement, we can't get anything. We can't make the process going further and the stakes getting higher if we don't build such organization. So I believe we are all in a moment in which we really need to, I would say, support every attempt in all these countries to get better organization. And it's also a question that is crossed all throughout this chapter, whether it's about Iraq, whether it's about Lebanon, whether it's about Sudan, what type of organizations do we need, and what organization can we concretely support and materially, but also politically for those who are imprisoned. And the experience also of in Iran on the fight on fighting for the liberation of political prisoners is important, because this phenomenon in Algeria is getting worse. So we need to also see how Iranians manage to bring up, international campaigns to liberate political prisoners.
Yes. So Lebanon, Joey, what about what struck you?
Well, so I'll just add to what's already been said. So I will mention a few things. We can talk about, and these are all basically entire separate conversations in themselves. Like the role of foreign governments in our separate context is, to various extents, pretty severe. I mean, in the case of Iraq, the role of Iran is pretty overwhelming. In the case of Lebanon, it's also a mixture of Iran and the Saudis and a bit of the West, and it gets even messier in some ways. It's very difficult sometimes to only talk about, for example, the uprising in Lebanon without also having to know what's happening in the region. It's not impossible, but it just makes it all the more difficult. Two obvious factors to kind of take into account is the gender factor and the generational factor. And we can also add the class factor, but I think we've mentioned this quite a bit already. The generational factor is pretty obvious. The vast majority of those in power are from the older generations, and a pretty significant percentage of those protesting are from the younger generation, often actually the majority. And the gender component is also pretty obvious. These are patriarchal systems. The overwhelming 99.999% of those who are ruling are men, especially those who are military men in specific contexts. Whereas among protesters, it tends to be more varied, and often we've also seen, women leading quite a few protests from Lebanon to Iraq to Sudan, Algeria, and so on. So just these are just things that I'm throwing out there. I know we've already talked about them, and so I won't necessarily go back, and hash them out completely. But I just felt it's important to highlight as my own closing note, because I essentially agree with everything that's already been said.
Great. Sara, Sudan, what struck you about the other chapters? What did you learn?
I learned a lot actually from the other chapters. I felt that I found them very moving, first of all, reading them, because both for the things that resonated and the things that did not, but rather than a compare and contrast, what I thought was really interesting across the different chapters is the ways in which they were able to show how embedded this wave is in these histories of struggle. And I felt that was somehow clear across the different chapters. And it made me really go back to this question of really the fact that this book challenges the idea of revolution or uprising being an event, and rather an accumulation of struggle that at certain moments becomes visible or reaches more points of conflict, essentially, and has more transformative potential. So while I read about Iraq, sectarianism in particular is not the issue in Sudan, but many things resonate, which is the organization of the state in Lebanon and Iraq on sectarian lines, in Sudan in many different ways along ethnic and tribal lines, so, or regional lines sometimes. So essentially the ways in which the state governs through these, and this is civilian or military, so governs through these structures of differentiating and dividing along these sort of constructed things. And I thought that it was, for me, always reading about Algeria is very interesting. There's some differences in the sense that, of course, we are a military Islamist regime, but the structure of the political economy of the country resonates in many, many different ways to us. And I think while the Algeria chapter very much made clear how the Hirak or the movement now is in a way a continuation of the decolonizing movements of the past, I could see this this desire for self-determination in the different contexts, actually, that across. So this was also, I found it incredibly interesting. And a sort of like one question that came up for me reading is this idea of, while it's very clear that in all of these contexts, the demands are very crisp and clear now, much crisper and clearer. People are very clear, movements are very clear about what it is that they want. One thing that maybe is still unfolding or has not developed to the same extent is the imaginations of alternative governance structures, right? So not so much the demands, but how do you govern yourself in a way that is different from the past? Sort of the tools and the structures, right? And so Selma had mentioned, I always hear from Algerians this, that it's good that we had the Sudanese Professionals Association, but I would say it's also something that we find that it's got a downside, which is that when you have this very clear leadership, it is also very, in some ways, it's harder to divide the movements, but it becomes captured also by the elite in a much clearer way, right? So the way that the Forces for Freedom and Change became the negotiators on behalf of the people, and from April, you see the class conflict becoming very clear, with them taking a direction to really stabilize the system and kind of trying to put the brake on change. So I think this is also very interesting, this issue of leadership that I saw from the one chapter to the other.
That's very, very interesting. So Jade, you were responsible for giving birth to this book, this Region in Revolt. It was an extraordinarily inspired thing to have made happen. Apart from spelling Sara's surname correctly, what would you have done differently?
There was a bit of a question at the beginning of this book. Do we want it to be a comparative book, or do we want to give it give each country its own voice, and in that way help reconceptualize the region? I mean, a really maybe cheeky answer here would be I would have wanted it to be longer. Like, there's just so much more to cover. There's so much more to talk about, and maybe even bring this kind of comparative study at the end of what would be good for all of these countries. How can we truly build solidarity so that all of these countries can transcend their political economy, which continues to create these crises, and generate new modes of self-governance. We've seen in the absence of this regional solidarity, we see how these movements are orienting again to the global hegemonic forces, back to the US, normalizing relations with Israel, that type of stuff. So it's important to not just think about alternatives in each nation, but also as the region as a whole. And what I really enjoyed in working on this project, and it definitely was a group project. It wasn't just myself. It helped me reconceptualize the region and to look at what the first wave was called the Arab Spring. Can we call this an Arab Spring 2.0 now with the inclusion of Iran, and now with the depth of the different cultures we've seen in Algeria? It's just the world itself, of the region, we need to think of it in a more different way, as well as the relationships of all these countries with their political economy. So a bit of a long way of saying, I think we did a good job. There's not much I would change. I would like to go in more depth on issues of solidarity and building regional networks of support as well.
Well, I mean, I think, the most important thing that you've achieved as a group is to catch history on its wings, and I think that's very, very important. And it gives a sense of movement, but that movement continues even today. The book is out of date. There's so much going on in each of the countries, and so. Would you think of a volume 2?
I think we might have to. I mean, for me, where the movements have gotten to is we're in a place where the ruling classes keep hitting up on their maximum, on what they can do. They can't do more than what they can at the moment to try and keep themselves in power. At the same time, we see in the movement struggling with their own contradictions, in some places a lack of leadership, a lack of clarity, a lack of kind of hegemony amongst the social movement, the forces of change themselves. And once we come out of this COVID, there's no doubt, since these contradictions have not been resolved yet, that there will be be it a third wave or a continuation of this wave, whichever way you want to look at it. So there will be stuff we will have to review on what we've written so far as well. As much as we've tried to make this as relevant to what's happening now, we might go back and go, oh, maybe our analysis was off, and adjust to that. So this is as I said in the introduction of the book, a long revolutionary process that will continue into the future. So definitely maybe a version 2 of this.
Well, this has been a really, really interesting discussion, and we could have spoken for much, much longer. I'd like to thank you, all of you, for participating in this initiative. I should mention that this was made possible with the support of the Transnational Institute, TNI, who generously supported the initiative by buying lots of copies of the book. So to you, Jade, Jade Saab, Sara Abbas, Selma Oumari, Zeidon Alkinani, Joey Ayoub, and Frieda Afary, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for an excellent, excellent book.